So let's say you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there YouTube, and specifically Cindi, who I think might actually watch this series. I'm here today because a while back Cindi Lincoln, who is Kent Hovind's ex, and who was allegedly physically, emotionally, and financially abused by him, took to Facebook saying that while she knew that Kent was an abusive liar, she was still convinced by his amazing evidence, and inviting people to dispute that evidence. Well, you know, that's right up my alley. Now, this is a bit of a different sort of video series. You see, Cindi is someone for whom I have a lot of sympathy. She was badly mistreated by the people at Dinosaur Adventureland, and I do not in any way want to re-victimize her. So this series is going to be less snarky than normal, and unlike many of the people I've covered, I don't think Cindi is being deceptive. I think she is honestly misinformed. I also will not be addressing strictly theological claims. If you're here for a debunking of the Trinity or Christianity or the Incarnation, you're in the wrong place. Lastly, I am not linking to the original videos because I don't want anyone to go bug Miss Lincoln. Not that I expect my audience would, but better safe than sorry. So with that preamble out of the way, let's meet today's star, Miss Cindi Lincoln.
Here we are again at Dinosaur Adventureland, where God gets the glory for his creation instead of evolution. We're going to do day 6 right now. We've already done videos for days 1 through 5, if you'd like to see those. Please do. Okay, day 6, God said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle, creeping things, and beasts of the earth after their kind."
So the first thing I want to point out here is that the Bible is really vague about what a kind is. See, the thing about words like type or kind is that they, both in English and in Hebrew, are intentionally ambiguous. Let's use food as an analogy. Say you try a new fruit and decide to ask what kind of fruit it is. At this point, you're probably being specific down to the species or even cultivar level. For example, a Granny Smith and a Red Delicious might be different kinds, and they're the same species. On the other hand, if you say, "I'd like this kind of meal after a nice pad Thai dinner," that might mean that you like Thai food, or even Southeast Asian food, or perhaps just takeout. That could involve a huge variety of things that are in fact quite different. The Bible too uses kinds broadly and narrowly. In this passage, basically grouping everything that doesn't live in water or fly into only about 3 kinds. The Bible isn't here to be a book on taxonomy. That isn't something you can glean honestly from the text, and it certainly wasn't the reason any of it was written.
Would you say that includes dinosaurs?
No, the only dinosaurs explicitly mentioned in the Bible are the ones that it says were created on day 5. But also, the authors weren't even aware of non-avian dinosaurs. However, if they had been, then they probably would have been created on day 5.
Yes.
Of course, beast. Okay, that is if you believe in them, which I'm going to try and convince you. Okay, and God said, "Let us make man in our image." Man? Dinosaur? Same day?
Sure, I'm perfectly happy to say that man and dinosaurs, had the authors known of dinosaurs, would probably have been put into the same day as humans.
In the textbooks, we're taught that dinosaurs became extinct millions of years before humans evolved. I would like to present evidence that that is false. Okay? Before I go there, I want to point this out. Us and our. Who is God talking to here? Let us make man in our image.
He is speaking to his divine council, as we can also see in Job, what's probably the oldest book in the Bible, and the one in which Satan is a member of the divine council, acting as a kind of prosecutor of mortals. These beings were conceived of as entities lesser in power than Yahweh, but still would probably be described as godlike.
There's more than one, okay? So that, we believe, is the very first mention of the Trinity. So there's a verse in the New Testament in 1 John 5:7, "For there are 3 that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost. And these 3 are one."
So here's the problem. That verse isn't even in the Bible. Now, sure, you can find it in your KJV, but that's because the KJV didn't rely on manuscripts. It relied on the Textus Receptus, which was a Greek edition of the New Testament, itself based on only very late manuscripts, and in some places not even on Greek manuscripts. Parts of the Textus Receptus were back translated from Latin to Koine Greek. In fact, we know where this verse comes from. Our oldest sources for the text of 1 John, such as quotations of the work from St. Clement of Alexandria, show no hint of it. It's not in the oldest manuscripts, and the text itself is variable in both Greek and Latin, indicating it is probably not original to the text. Even the Catholic Church's latest Latin translation omits it, as do basically all English translations since the late 19th century. After this, Miss Lincoln makes more explicitly theological claims. I'm not here really to have that discussion, and so I am omitting them.
Dinosaurs and humans on the same day. Now, all the way from this room all the way to the end, there is like a quadrillion of evidence, so just bear with me, there's a lot. The very most common one is the Loch Ness Monster, okay? This is two different pictures of people who report seeing Nessie. Loch Ness is Lake Ness. It's in Scotland. There have been over 11,000 reports of this creature in that lake.
Well, no, not really. There have been lots of reports of a creature, but they vary from being a blob with a trunk, to being a snake-like thing with a horse head, to being a bunch of bumps in the water, to, yes, looking like a plesiosaur. But interestingly, they look like late 19th and early 20th century media depictions of plesiosaurs, not the actual animals as they would have looked in life. Loch Ness is a deep and mysterious place, but there are no unknown reptiles hanging out in it. In fact, environmental DNA testing was done at the loch, and the only surprise was that it has eels that no one has seen. There was no anomalous reptile signature. The sad fact of the matter is that Nessie isn't a real thing. It's a feature of popular imagination, not nature.
11,000 people all making up a fairy tale? Or this creature lives there?
No, very few of them were making things up. Most probably saw something. But the thing is, if you think a plesiosaur is in the lake that you're looking at, and you see something your brain can't quite figure out, it's not much of a leap for it to conclude that it's a plesiosaur. Basically, this is just like pareidolia, the phenomenon of the brain taking an essentially random stimuli and interpreting it as something familiar and recognizable. Here's a famous example. The face on Mars, as seen in the original picture of it that made it famous. It's hard not to see a face. It's so obvious. Look, it even has a nostril. Never mind that the nostril is actually a data drop, where the satellite returned no information for that pixel, and you can see lots more around. But even without that hole in the data, it sure looks like a face. But here's that same bit of rock under more even lighting and in higher resolution, and without the holes in the data. I mean, it's still vaguely face-like, I guess. But clearly this wasn't something we need ancient Martian sculptors to explain. Similarly, if you see a strange wake, or a few otters in a lake when you're not ready for it, you might mistake it for a world-famous monster said to inhabit that lake. The fact is that eyewitnesses just aren't enough to conclude that an organism exists. We need physical evidence. And not only is there none, there's plenty against the idea. What with the whole lake sonar surveys and eDNA studies failing to turn up even a trace of such a monster.
If you'll notice, Loch Ness is really, really, really deep, and it has underwater caves. Perfect hideouts for a plesiosaur.
Those caves are going to need a way to get oxygen-rich air at the top of them, which seems pretty unlikely with no known outlet to the surface above the water. This is because plesiosaurs are reptiles. In fact, they're probably related to turtles. Turtles need to come up for air. You can't just keep them completely underwater, except for some sealed-off pockets of air in a cave with no circulation. They will die. I promise you.
They have tried to film it, and they just have this one flipper-like thing. I don't know if it's his flipper or his tail.
Those pictures are the result of a 1972 expedition by Robert Rines, and according to Charles Wyckoff, the image showing a clear rhomboid flipper was altered from the original negatives to look like a flipper, because if the original negatives are developed, they just show a bunch of nothing, not an obvious flipper. Sure, you can kinda see how we got the flipper shape out of it, but you could equally draw lots of other stuff. The original photos were basically a Rorschach test, and what Ryan saw was a flipper. When I look at the original, I see some tiny plants. What you see may differ, because the subject of the photo could be just about anything you could find in a lake.
Okay. One of the ways you can tell if this is a fairy tale or not is something the Bible calls 2 or 3 witnesses, okay? In the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall every word be established. First of all, I already pointed out 11,000 people, that's more than 2 or 3 witnesses. But another thing that works in a court of law is details, okay? If you have more than one witness with the same detail, It lends veracity to the story.
So we're pointing to a picture based off the case of Dr. Arthur Grant, a veterinarian, who claimed to see the Loch Ness Monster on land. A few things. Here's his original sketch. Now, we know this can't be a sketch of a plesiosaur for a few reasons, but let's hear what Cindi has to say before we jump too far ahead.
Okay, this is not the same, right? This flipper tail is a detail that if more than one witness says it, it could mean they both saw the same thing. Okay, stay right there. I'm going to get something here.
Okay, but here's that sketch that Dr. Grant himself made. It has no tail fluke, which, by the way, it should if it's a plesiosaur, and it has hind legs with distinct toes, so this can't be a plesiosaur. And Dr. Grant himself described it as a cross between an otter and a plesiosaur, so while he did compare it to such a reptile, he also distinguished it from one.
In addition to Nessie, there is Tessie in Lake Tahoe, Chessie in the Chesapeake Bay, Bessie in Lake Erie, Champ in Lake Champlain, Ogopogo. When I started mapping them out, I got 25.
That's not surprising. There are a lot of people looking for things they don't recognize in a lot of lakes, most of whom are familiar with the concept of lake monsters. In fact, I'm honestly a bit surprised that it's not more than 25. Not that I'm questioning Miss Lincoln's research into the topic. Just that given how many lakes there are and how many people look at them and how many of them know about lake monsters, it's kind of weird that any large lakes would lack such a legend.
Okay, but one of them that shows this detail is from Lake Tahoe, which would be Tessie. Okay, notice Tessie's tail? It's flipper-like, just like that.
Okay, but in both the mug and the picture being shown, they are artist impressions. They're not actually in accordance with any particular eyewitness account, despite in the case of the poster, a sketch of such being available. Also, the mug is clearly depicting a European-style dragon with a diamond-shaped tail, as is common in Art of Dragons. I can't find any such descriptions of the tail of Tessie. In fact, according to the Tahoe Daily Tribune, people almost never see the head or tail of Tessie. So this detail isn't really part of the sightings themselves, it's a common theme a couple of artists used.
So if we have two witnesses on opposite sides of the world, here's Lake Tahoe, here's Loch Ness, they're opposite sides of the world reporting the same detail. In a court of law, that would be lending veracity.
I agree. That would be an interesting detail for independent witnesses to give. But that isn't what has happened here. Instead, we have two artists basing this detail on nothing I can find in the actual reports of these lake monsters. If anyone does have a source for this tail fluke in the actual witness accounts, please let me know. I would be quite interested to read them. But as is, this claim fails at the point of there being no such eyewitness reports I can find after looking.
This one also has a strange kind of a triangular tail. This is Alti. Alti just washed up in Georgia not that long ago. There was already a visitor's center statue of it, and then when it washed up, it lended credibility to the statue. I think that was only 2013. You'd have to Google it.
So we have a few problems with this Alti claim. One is that the supposed body was never actually studied by scientists, and we seem to have only this one picture of it. The texture of the body is strange, looking more like papier-mâché than animal hide. It also only has front flippers, but all known plesiosaurs had 4 well-developed flippers. It also has a tail like that of a shark, and not a diamond-shaped fluke as we would expect from a plesiosaur. The face also kind of looks like a muppet, and is not at all like the streamlined plesiosaur head. Also, despite plesiosaurs usually having enormous needle-like teeth, this creature seemingly has none. Additionally, the presumed body organs are spilling out of one tiny incision, and there's no way to tell if they really came from this creature. All in all, this is probably a hoax, especially given the implausible anatomy, and even if it's not a plesiosaur.
Here's some of the other Nessies, okay? This is Champ, Lake Champlain. Sandy Mancy got that picture. Dr. Hoven actually interviewed her. You can hear that interview in Dr. Hoven's video called Dinosaurs and the Bible by Kent Hoven. Dr. Hoven said, "Do you think you really saw a dinosaur?" She said, "No, I know I saw a dinosaur."
Well, I'm not here to challenge the honesty of Sandra Mancy. I think she does feel confident that she saw something that she would describe as a dinosaur, although it should be noted that plesiosaurs are not in fact dinosaurs. But that's neither here nor there. The subject of this photograph is probably a log floating in the lake, and investigation of the area where the sighting occurred has shown that the water is only 14 feet deep. hardly enough room for a plesiosaur to maneuver in, let alone hide in, as would be required for it to be such a rare sight.
And then it looks like there's two different kinds of monsters in Champlain. This looks more like a serpent creature. We had that over here as well. This creature here, which I don't know how to say the name, looks more serpentine. It doesn't look like a plesiosaur.
Okay, but before, the alleged consistency of details lent credence to the idea of late surviving plesiosaurs in lakes. But now inconsistency doesn't detract from the idea. See, that's the thing with a lot of this, and of cryptozoological stuff in general. It's basically confirmation bias. Only data that seems to support the favored idea is accepted, and even data that doesn't can be construed to fit the idea. This isn't how science works. That's why we have peer review, so that people without the researcher's bias can bring a different perspective to check to see if the conclusions really do follow from the data.
Okay, this is the California Nessie. She washed up in Monterey around 1925. It's reported in Skin Diver magazine. Notice that is not a creationist magazine. Notice the 20-foot neck. Okay, that's about from here to that black roof up there. That's a long neck.
That's the corpse of a beaked whale, probably a female. The neck is actually the whole body. You can see the characteristic shape of the mouth, the odd way the eyes protrude just a bit, and the now rotting melon, which is starting to reveal the shape of the skull underneath. Beaked whales are rarely seen by humans, and so when they wash up as corpses, especially when badly decayed, they can look monstrous. But that's just how it is. Humans aren't used to seeing these things, so they jump to the wrong conclusion sometimes. That's not a bad thing, but that's why it's important to be skeptical and not just assume that your first conclusion is accurate.
This was actually pulled up by a fishing boat, a Japanese fishing boat, and the Japanese government actually made a commemorative stamp.
That's a basking shark. I know it kind of looks like a plesiosaur, but that's because all that's left is its skeleton. Sharks have a cartilage skeleton and no real bones, but that cartilage is still the last part of the shark to decay aside from the teeth. But when a shark dies, most of the rest of it decays first, including the gills and the muscles attaching the jaw to the rest of the body. So when that falls off, you have a cranium, spine, and fins, which together look a bit like a plesiosaur. As for the government of Japan making a plesiosaur stamp, that's not really an argument, so I don't have anything to add to that.
There's also land dinosaurs. This is Mokele-mbembe, located in the Congo. The Congo is a jungle that is very uninhabited.
According to the World Wildlife Fund, there are more than 75 million humans living in the Congo with about 150 distinct ethnic groups. Sure, it's not as densely inhabited as, say, New York City, but it isn't exactly devoid of humans. 75 million is a lot. But another problem is that in addition to being inconsistently described, Mokele-mbembe is almost certainly not a sauropod, since it's aquatic, and sauropods certainly were not. In fact, given how long their necks are, they would have had serious trouble breathing if they were to submerge themselves, as the pressure in water would make it hard for the lungs to overcome the head loss of their necks.
Same with the Amazon area, has another diplodocus.
So this is not some legend from the locals of the Amazon basin. This is a story by Percy Fawcett, and he doesn't even claim to have seen it. He claimed to talk to people who saw it, and there are few details. Further, Fawcett claimed to have encountered many creatures we would now call cryptids. In this case, I do question his honesty, because at the time, in 1919, it was extremely hard for anyone to go to the Amazon and fact-check him, and as a, quote, explorer, he got money from making exciting stories out of his travels. When you can make more money by saying you saw extraordinary things, you might just do that, even if your sightings aren't really true. Of course, scientific investigation has failed to turn up any of Fawcett's monsters, including a 62-foot-long anaconda, a cat dog, a dog with 2 noses, a huge toothless freshwater shark, or a huge black mole snake.
It's not very much people live there. Okay, if you have a panther in Florida today, as soon as the next person builds a house, the panther's going to move on to a more secluded place. They're scared of us. So that would make sense that these creatures would only be still surviving away from people.
The population of the Amazon rainforest is about 30 million, with less than 2 million being indigenous groups. So in this case, given what a wide area it is, and how few of them are actually living in relatively untamed areas, as opposed to cities and towns where wildlife would be less common, I'll agree. This is not a heavily inhabited region. I agree, if these creatures exist, they probably live as far from humans as they can reasonably get. But there's a difference between these things and a panther. We know panthers exist. You can find them in captivity. People routinely photograph them, hunt them, find their bodies, find their tracks, find their scat, etc. And it's not just in the form of eyewitnesses. We have extensive physical evidence of panthers. We do not have such for any of these claimed animals. After this, Cindi gives a story about a missionary and some Congolese natives talking about what Mokele-mbembe looks like and its temperament. I don't really have anything to say about it, so I cut it out.
This is a book by Dr. Hoven called Claws, Jaws, and Dinosaurs, and it's co-authored by William Gibbons, who has been to the Congo 6 times looking for Mokele-mbembe.
Then, since we still have no physical evidence, he's 0 for 6. Now here's the thing, the Congo has 2 large animals in it that were at one time cryptids. You might not know this, but until relatively recently, the existence of both the gorilla and the okapi were unconfirmed, and thought by many simply not to exist. But the difference here is that when you go on an expedition to find gorillas and okapi, you can find them. Apparently no one can find Mokele-mbembe.
This creature from the Amazon River in South America, when I was looking for what his name is, I couldn't find any name for this guy.
That's because it's apparently the invention of one white guy, and not something that the locals believe in and would therefore have a name for.
But I found 3 different independent expeditions that were going down for separate purposes that all ran into evidence of him. There was a student group going down to map the flora and the fauna. There was a geology group going down to map minerals or look for minerals, and they all don't know each other, but they all had the same run-in with this creature.
I'm not sure what expeditions Miss Lincoln is talking about. If she is watching, I would love for her to let me know, and perhaps send links so I can see what she's talking about. But since I don't have enough information here to really talk about these expeditions, I don't really know that I can respond to it. So Cindi, if you're watching, please let me know what these expeditions are.
Now, remember we talked about Adam living to be 900, and the possibility that lizards, if they lived to be 900, would be large. Okay, that's in the gigantism section.
These videos are not uploaded in chronological order, so I'm sure she had just given that talk before everybody got to this exhibit. But here's the thing about lizards. While they are indeterminate growers, their growth slows with age. The older a lizard is, the slower it grows, and the largest lizards in the world, the Komodo dragon, lives about 30 years. On the other hand, the tuatara, while a sphenodon, the sister group to lizards, and not technically a lizard, can live for about a century, but it's much, much smaller. The tuatara is tiny compared to the Komodo dragon. Another example would be Cuvier's dwarf caiman, which can live about 25 years and get up to about 4 feet long. By contrast, an American alligator, both in alligatoridea I would add, will in that same time get to about 10 feet long, more than twice as big. But on the other hand, even 45 years later, that same alligator will be unlikely to have grown even 4 more feet. So just being old won't turn a lizard or an alligator into a behemoth.
That was in day 2. So lizards are indeterminate growers. You and I are not. When we get to be 18, we stop growing, okay? Lizards, if they live to be 900, they grow that whole time, okay? They don't stop at 18 like we do. So here we could have, now this is a guess. This is actually, we had this guy, a Jackson's chameleon. He's got 3 horns. He died. He was really nice.
I remember when Kent announced that he got that animal. It was not that long ago. I can't say for sure, as they only live about a decade, and I don't know how old it was when he got it, but it seems fast for it to have died, if it got proper care. I would submit that Kent perhaps cares about as much about taking care of his pets as he seems to care about taking care of his partners, which apparently is not at all. If you have a pet lizard that needs to be rehoused, please don't send it to Kent Hoven. Those are not easy pets to take care of without doing your homework.
But let's say he lived to be 900, and he kept growing that entire time. For example, we have an anaconda skin upstairs, I'll show you too, that's just humongous. It's like 20 feet long. Starts out like a baby snake, just like all the other creatures, they start as a baby. So, if that Jackson's chameleon could grow really, really big, perhaps maybe he could be a triceratops? I don't know.
First for the anaconda. In the wild, they typically live about a decade, and yet are some of the largest snakes alive. On the other hand, the Sinaloan milk snake lives about half again as long, but only gets to about 3.5 feet long, whereas anacondas get to 15 to 19 feet long. This is because, again, size in reptiles is not primarily driven by age. It's predominantly driven by genetics and nutrition. Age is a secondary factor. Second, let's go over why Jackson's chameleon cannot be a young Triceratops. For one thing, we know what a young Triceratops looks like, because we have their remains. They are not Jackson's chameleons. But let's go over the anatomical differences between Triceratops and a Jackson's chameleon. We'll start at the front and work our way back. So first we have the fact that Triceratops has 2 whole bones at the front of its face that the Jackson's chameleon doesn't have at all. These are the rostral bone, unique to ceratopsians, and the predentary bone, unique to ornithischian dinosaurs. This already rules out the Jackson's chameleon as being a Triceratops, but there's much more. Now let's look at the teeth. In the Jackson's chameleon, they're fairly well spaced and present along the dentary, maxilla, and premaxilla. On a Triceratops, they are absent on the premaxilla and only appear on the posterior end of the maxilla and dentary. Further, the teeth of Triceratops are set more medially than those of the Jackson chameleon, which basically run along the outer edge of the jaw. Triceratops' teeth also form tight batteries that occlude each other. This allows them to grind plants effectively, as opposed to the Jackson's chameleon's teeth, which are pointy and don't always occlude, which helps them crunch down on insects, their primary food. Further, the Jackson chameleon lacks an antorbital fenestra, which is quite prominent on the Triceratops skull. There are more problems just on the skull, but let's move on. Triceratops has 10 neck bones, or vertebrae, with the front 4 being fused into each other. Jackson's chameleons have about 5, none of which are fused. Next, let's see about the feet. First, the front. In Triceratops, we have 5 fingers on their front legs, digits 1 and 2 facing mostly forward, while digits 3 through 5 turn laterally so that digit 5 is facing off to the side. In the chameleon, we have 5 digits which are split into 2 opposing groups, one with 3 digits and the other with 2. These close together so that they can grip branches and have sharp claws on all digits. In the Triceratops, only digits 1, 2, and 3 have claws at all, and they're more like hooves than the curved claws of a chameleon. Chameleon hind feet are almost the same as their front feet, whereas Triceratops only has 4 toes on the back feet. Digit 1 is a dew claw, and digits 2, 3, and 4 are roughly equally sized weight-bearing toes that all face forward. Let's talk about the hips. The chameleon has a pretty basic lizard hip, with a front projecting ischium and no firm attachment in the bones of the sacral vertebrae and the iliac. There are also only 2 sacral vertebrae. On the other hand, the ischium of Triceratops points to the back of the animal, and it has 10 sacral vertebrae, all of which are firmly attached to the ilium, forming a synsacrum. Further, the hip socket of chameleons, like all non-dinosaurs, is a closed cup of bone, whereas in Triceratops it is a ring of bone. The femur for Triceratops has a 4th trochanter, where the chameleon's does not, it being a lepidosaur and not an archosaur. Further, the ankle joints of the chameleon allow it to bend its foot in many directions, and are not fused to the tibia or fibula. In Triceratops, there is fusion of the tarsal bones to the tibia, and they only allow motion in one axis, which provides more stability, but far less flexibility. Lastly, let's look at the tail. The tail of the Jackson's chameleon has short, widely spaced, and non-overlapping caudal ribs. This facilitates the use of the rail as a grasping organ, allowing it to hold onto branches securely. By contrast, the caudal ribs of Triceratops are close to each other, preventing the kind of motion that the chameleon uses, but providing extra attachment surfaces for various muscles that in dinosaurs, but not in lizards, stretch between the tail and the hind limbs. So you see, there really is no chance of a Triceratops being an old Jackson's chameleon. These animals are similar only in the most superficial ways.
And these are some pictures of some living lizards today. They look kind of like dinosaurs, especially him. That's a marine iguana.
I have to respectfully disagree. No lizard looks very much like any dinosaur. They all have too many fingers, sprawling legs, the wrong kind of scale, short necks, etc. But further, this is what Gutsick Gibbon likes to call just eyeballing it, which is not how science is done. I will say, however, that having some Draco lizards, a eublepharid, a geconid, what looks like a chuckwalla, a monitor, and an iguana is a nice display of lizard diversity. Well done to whomever put that montage up. But really, the only thing I wish were there is a Gila monster or a Mexican beaded lizard.
Flying reptiles?
Well, gliding, and using its ribs to do it, which is cool and really weird.
This actually was texted to Dr. Hoven just last year, and you'll notice it has this pattern of circle of circles. Circle of circles. It looked just like a dinosaur to me, so I Googled it and I found out that these creatures are still alive. This guy is much more convincing even than the Jackson's chameleon. If he went 900 years, he would definitely be a dinosaur.
Okay, so near as I can tell, those were Asian water monitors, Varana salvator. I can't completely rule out V. niloticus, the Nile monitor, but those are less popular as pets, and the coloration is closer to typical for V. salvator. Water monitors are popular among reptile keepers who want big, impressive animals. As for the ichthyostones, I'll address that some other time if we go more in depth on those claims. But as for the fossil skin impression that was shown, that's a skin impression of Triceratops. And further, the large circles on Triceratops are a single structure, but as you can see on the picture of the close-up of the water monitor scales, these circles are a coloration pattern of about 20 or so individual scales. Further, we don't even know if the large scales on Triceratops were a different color than the others, so there may not even have been a visual similarity in life. As for a monitor growing into a dinosaur, what dinosaur would that be? Varanids or monitor lizards are carnivorous quadrupeds, so in addition to having about the same reasons we know it's not a dinosaur as we already went over at length with the Jackson's chameleon, what dinosaur would it grow into? There are no carnivorous quadrupeds among the dinosaurs. I can say that it's not unreasonable to think of dinosaurs as lizards for a layperson, like Miss Lincoln, but if you want to teach that that's the case, you have to look into the details of the anatomy of these animals. Most people can't do that, but all people who can, including other creationists, conclude that dinosaurs are certainly not lizards. Now I know that Cindi is not primarily getting these ideas herself. She got them from Kent, whom I am trying not to bring up as Cindi is his victim, and I hope she watches this, and I don't want to bring up anything that might be traumatizing. But I want everyone to remember that Kent Hovind, who calls himself Dr. Dino, couldn't even tell me what a dinosaur was when I asked him live in debate, link above. So Cindi, if you're watching this, please don't take his word for things about taxonomy or anatomy. Check with even other creationists, never mind mainstream scientists.
The ichthyostones as well show circle patterns when they do their dinosaur etchings. We're going to talk about the ichthyostones more later.
Alright, I'll save my ichthystone comments for later then.
But most likely, if someone's drawing a dinosaur with a circle on it, that's because they saw a dinosaur with a circle on it.
Okay, here's a picture of a dinosaur with a very fancy pattern. Now, this I can promise was not made because someone actually saw this pattern on a dinosaur. Instead, it was made up. How do you know how I know this for sure? It's because I made it up. Now, I based it on the markings of real animals, including lizards, birds, and cats, but still. Further, anyone who is going to take the time to draw a dinosaur is going to have to draw something for the skin, regardless of whether they have a life model. As a result, showing a Triceratops skin impression, then generalizing that to other dinosaurs as a group, then going from that to ichthyostones, then going from that to ichthyostones have circles, is a lot of logical leaps. We know that most dinosaurs did not have these large scales with circles of smaller scales around them, because we have skin impressions from many dinosaurs. This is basically unique among them.
Not all reptiles have that scaly pattern. They also have different patterns. And I found a really cool ichthystone. We had Dennis Swift here, who has been to Peru and has numerous ichthyostones. He's an ichthystone genius. So he came here to speak for our boot camp. And so I was doing all this research on ichthyostones, and I discovered this one. You'll notice he has no circles, and he's showing mammal behavior and live birth. Okay, Ica Peru is showing this. Okay, sauropods nursing.
Okay, but we know sauropods laid eggs because we have preserved sauropod eggs with sauropod babies in them. And we know that even if we ignore all the myriad reasons why we know that sauropods weren't mammals, they couldn't have nursed like that because they were born far too small to reach up to their mother's abdomens. This isn't a cool thing we have learned about sauropods from the ichthyostones. It's a reason we know they weren't drawn from life. Also, as for a sauropod eating someone, they generally couldn't fit a whole human in their mouth, and their teeth are spatulate and clearly made for stripping leaves, not tearing into a hapless Homo sapiens.
And then in Mexico, there is this artifact showing the actual wrinkles instead of the round scales, feet that look like elephants.
Okay, so elephant feet, which means we know that this isn't something sculpted based on seeing a real sauropod. We have sauropod foot bones and tracks. We know that their front feet were more like horseshoes than elephant feet. They don't have a fleshy cushion in the back. So they look like what you're seeing on screen. And remember, this isn't just a speculative reconstruction. We have footprints in fossil trackways. We can be completely certain that this is not how sauropod feet look, despite the fact that it's almost impossible to find the feet depicted any other way in pop culture. So what this means is that whoever carved this almost certainly based the depiction not on having seen a live sauropod, but on having seen them in pop culture depictions, further meaning that this statue is almost certainly of recent origin.
But he's got the long neck of a sauropod. So perhaps some of the sauropods were scaly, some of them mammals.
All mammals have more in common than just lactation. They also have a different jaw joint than other land animals. They have a rib cage that stops before the hips. They only have 7 neck bones. They have a zygomatic arch, etc. We know that sauropods can't be mammals because they lack every one of these features and then some.
Okay, here's another nice match. Okay, this is probably an ankylosaurus, kind of like dinosaur from Mexico.
I honestly don't see how that looks like an ankylosaur. If Cindy would like, she can send more information about this, but as of now, it looks like a fat iguana shaped into a musical instrument.
This one is a match, only it's on the cave painting walls in Australia. Mexico, Australia. Same creature, 2 witnesses, different continents.
I can't see the cave painting, but if it looks like that flute thing, it doesn't look like an ankylosaur. At least not to me. And to be fair, I do have a pretty good grasp on how various dinosaurs look.
This Edmontosaurus is also another cave painting found in the Grand Canyon right here in the United States.
Okay, this claim I am familiar with.
This is a close-up with the outline. This is the actual cave painting.
So it's really hard to make out on this video because of the lighting conditions. So here's a better picture of the painting and supposed reconstruction of an Edmontosaurus. The problem is that it looks nothing like an Edmontosaurus. This is what an Edmontosaurus would look like. Granted, the color is speculative, but that's the overall anatomy. In fact, this group of dinosaurs, the hadrosaurs, is quite well known. We even have a mummy of one, nicknamed Leonardo, that gives us a lot of information about the soft tissues of these animals. So whatever this is a painting of, it's something that you wouldn't draw based on seeing a real Edmontosaurus or relative.
This one is really cool. Okay, this is a mural from the 1600s. It's located in Greece in a monastery. If you look real close, you'll see there's a monastery built on top of those rocks. This mural shows Adam naming the animals. Do you see 2 strange animals that we thought were extinct?
I see arrows pointing to a dragon that doesn't resemble any dinosaur or pterosaur known, and a camel.
Flying fiery serpent with a crooked tail.
But that doesn't describe any extinct animal, and this depiction also doesn't look like any extinct animal. And this fresco is from the 17th century. So is the claim that there were dragons that looked like that flying around Greece at the beginning of the 17th century? Because that's pretty recent. I think we'd have a lot more evidence than just some cartoonish dragon pictures.
Brontosaur? Made the same day as Adam.
Okay, I get that the color is weird for a camel, but here's a clearer picture. This creature has a mammal-like face with ears that's recognizably shaped like a camel, and it has the hump of a dromedary camel, and even the characteristic down then up U-shaped curve to the neck. This is just a blue camel. Now that's an odd choice for color in a picture of a camel, but then Eastern Orthodox icons aren't known for picking realistic color. Human skin often has a greenish hue, the sky is usually gold, and indoor scenes are usually depicted outdoor, but there's a red cloth hanging up somewhere to tip you off it was indoors. Further, they often do things like reverse perspective, etc. Eastern Orthodox iconography is weird, but that's still much more likely a camel than a sauropod.
These 2 are about a creature that has been seen in the boundary water canoe area of Canada and Northern America, okay? All these Indian tribes have legends of a water lynx, an underwater panther. Here's another piece of artwork showing it. He's got horns like a bull.
Horns like a bull, spikes down its back, the body of a panther, and lives underwater. That doesn't describe even vaguely any dinosaur. We can't simply point to chimerical creatures and decide that 1, they are real, and 2, they are dinosaurs. To conclude that a picture depicts what we would think of as an extinct dinosaur, you need to confirm that it's an authentically ancient image. These are, as far as I can tell. You'd have to show it's not a composite of images, which these seem not to be, but last you'd have to show that it depicts an identifiable dinosaur, at least down to maybe the family level. This doesn't resemble anything that could be in any group of dinosaurs.
So the Indians say it has a head and paws of a giant cat, but it's covered in scales, and its spikes are like daggers running along its back and tail. Interesting. Kind of like a dinosaur.
No, there is no dinosaur that fits that description. I think the problem might be that Cindi has not really learned what the word dinosaur means. This is no surprise, as she spent years under the thumb of the guy who, let's remember, couldn't tell me what a dinosaur is when I asked him.
So let's say you found a skeleton. How would you tell if it's a dinosaur? You personally. How would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
But dinosaur is not simply a word that means big, scary, scaly thing from the past. It's a scientific group of animals with very specific anatomical traits and well-known divisions and subdivisions. Just like you can't say a Goliath spider is a mammal because both Goliath spiders and mammals are fuzzy, you can't say that anything described as being big and scaly is a dinosaur. And you especially can't do that with chimerical creatures. There are no chimerical creatures known today or in the fossil record. No griffins, no pegasi, no Babylonian dragons, no sphinxes, none of that. So if you want to propose that one existed, first, it wouldn't be a dinosaur. It would instead be basically proof positive of special creation. But second, you'd also need more than human depictions. You'd need actual remains. We don't have any remains of water panthers.
Here's a hadrosaur in a human artwork.
Well, here's a clearer picture of that animal. I don't know what it is, but I know it's not a hadrosaur. At least not one drawn from life. And I know that for the simple fact that it has external ears, so it's a mammal. And from the fact that it has claws on its front feet. We know hadrosaurs didn't have claws on their front feet in any digit but the thumb, and not even always then.
Now, our critics, the evolutionists and atheists, they say, well, you know what? We also find artwork of mermaids. That doesn't mean mermaids are real. That's true. However, there are no fossil mermaids. These creatures match known fossils.
But they don't. If they did, creationists could say which fossils, and then show how they match them. But instead we get kind of vague identifications of these alleged dinosaurs. And when someone who actually knows about these dinosaurs comes in, they see immediately that they look almost nothing like the actual creatures. Instead, they either look like mythical chimeras, or they look like pop culture depictions of dinosaurs, not the actual animals.
Reality-based. This is a really cool mosaic. In Roman times, it shows two long-necked dragons necking, 200 years after Christ.
But they have the head of Goofy from Disney cartoons. And a second head coming out of their back. That doesn't match any dinosaur, or even any animal. Animals don't have heads coming out of the middle of their backs.
This is a really cool statue found in Mexico. It's really small, but you see that tail is so long, it's longer than that body.
Quadruped dinosaur tails were never that long, and they don't drag on the ground. But lizard tails can be extremely long, and do often drag on the ground. But this is probably just a chimerical animal, because it doesn't strongly resemble a lizard, a mammal, or a dinosaur.
This is Peruvian fabric. There's the teeth. There's the body and the legs and the tail.
I mean, this Atari level of graphics makes it hard to identify that as anything in particular. I could just as easily say it's a South American camelid like a guanaco or alpaca or a llama.
Let's look at one of the more common dinosaur legends. Quote, legends. I think it's true. So, St. George and the Dragon. There are legends everywhere of heroes slaying dragons to save the village.
Right, but you have to remember that only in recent times did the word stop basically meaning dangerous reptile and come to be a more specific type of not real animal. These legends are probably based on people killing big, dangerous, scaly things like large monitor lizards, large venomous snakes, or crocodiles.
Now, the Bible uses the word dragon instead of dinosaur. Dinosaur wasn't invented until the 1800s. So in the Bible, you'll find the word dragon, flying fiery serpent, leviathan, behemoth, and cockatrice. Okay?
Well, you're not going to find cockatrice outside of the King James Version, but yes, if the Bible did talk about non-avian dinosaurs, I agree with Cindi, we shouldn't expect a translation written before the word dinosaur was invented to use that word. So the real question becomes, do any of the animals she listed off actually seem more likely to be dinosaurs, entirely mythical, or known non-dinosaurian animals? I don't know if she's going to get into the specifics, but if she does, I'll address these individually then.
So, if I had a child here, I would have him put on his knight in shining armor costume and get ready to battle the dragons.
That's pretty cute, not gonna lie.
This is the best shot here because it actually not only shows the knight and the dragon, but it shows bones of humans and sheep, showing that this dragon was a menace and had to be destroyed in order to save the village. Here's the damsel in distress and her sheep.
Okay, but this carving was made in 1450, according to your poster. That's more than 11 centuries after the story happened. Why do we think that 11 and a half centuries after the fact, when there are no cameras, that the depiction of the dragon in art would look anything like the creature St. George killed, assuming the story is even true? Further, we know that the story is set in the southern Mediterranean and not in Western Europe, but everything here is in the trappings of 15th century Europe. So we know that this is not an accurate depiction in the details besides the dragon, so why should we take the depiction of the dragon as basically the only accurate part of this picture?
This is an altar cloth in Spain, dated around the 1400s.
This is a minor point, and I don't think the mistake is Cindy's, but I want to point out that this is not an altar cloth. Altar cloths only depict a very few scenes in any church, and Catholic ones tend not to have pictures on them at all. What this is the front piece of an altar carved by Antonio Saddurini in the Chapel of St. George in the Palace of the Generalitat in Barcelona. So if you were in the chapel standing in the nave facing the altar, you would see this relief carving facing you.
Same story over here in Sweden. The hero, the dragon, and the human bones.
But this dragon looks very little like the first one we saw, so I'm not sure what we're supposed to take away from this other than artists have wildly different takes on the same legend. After this is just a lot more pictures of St. George in which the dragon has very little consistency and all of which were made centuries to over a millennium after the alleged events. So I feel like I've covered that.
Both Alexander the Great and Marco Polo had journal entries talking about dragons that scared their people.
Now we're just back to eyewitnesses aren't terribly good evidence, especially after the fact, and especially now that we use the word dragon in a way they didn't. So if they saw a big Asian water monitor come out of a cave, they'd probably call it a dragon, and with good reason. They can bite off fingers, cut through muscle and tendon like butter. They could kill a man easily, especially at a time when there was no reliable medicine, no antibiotics, and people barely understood how to staunch bleeding. Similarly, they may well have described various crocodilians of India as dragons. Before we leap to the conclusion that they saw dinosaurs in India, we first have to establish their stories are true, then we have to establish why the animals they describe couldn't be any of the known fauna of the area, and then we have to establish that the animals they describe actually resemble real dinosaurs. We haven't done any of those things. After this, it's much more depictions of dragons that don't look like any dinosaur, especially in that dinosaur tails aren't crooked, they don't have bat wings, and dinosaurs only ever had 4 limbs, not the 6 often seen in these pictures.
Today, in Papua New Guinea, there's talk of some kind of pterodactyl that has bioluminescence, glows in the dark.
This is the ropin, a cryptid from Papua New Guinea. Trey the Explainer has done a far more thorough video on this than I ever could, so simply check the link above for that video. Then come back or finish this video and check his out afterwards.
Have you ever heard of the Bombardier beetle?
Nope.
No? Supposedly they live in Alabama. I really would like one. If you catch one, bring it here. So the Bombardier beetle actually can shoot fire out its tailpipe.
Well, scalding liquid, not actual fire. Nothing gets set on fire after being sprayed by a Bombardier beetle, but they can get burned.
So if you've ever made a volcano in school, you take vinegar and baking soda. Two separate ingredients, they're inert. Put them together, they explode, and you make a volcano. Same with the Bombardier beetle. He's got twin chambers in his rear. One has hydrogen peroxide and one has hydroquinone, if I'm not mistaken. They're inert by themselves, but when they go out the same tailpipe.
While I understand that this is a simplified explanation, it is vital to note that these chemicals together do not react violently, because the activation energy for the reaction is too high for it to occur at the rate needed at normal temperatures and pressure. The beetle actually uses 2 enzymes to break down both chemicals first. Now on its own, hydroquinone is mildly toxic and irritating to skin. Insects secrete it in order to harden their exoskeletons, so it's already lying around insects anyway. And it is used in some insects, such as stink bugs, and other members of the Bombardier beetle's family, Carabidae, to make them unpalatable to predators. In other carabid beetles, the hydroquinone collects into not quite internal pockets on the exoskeleton, near the anus. So we actually have living transitional forms for the Bombardier beetle. Hydrogen peroxide can also be synthesized by life forms and is both toxic and irritating to sensitive parts such as the eyes and mouth of predators. So it only needs to be secreted onto the back of our developing Bombardier beetle for it to gain even more protection from predators. Now, if the storage area for these chemicals becomes internalized, the reservoirs of them will be easier to maintain, since they will both evaporate less, and muscle action could be used to propel chemicals out of the organism, which will allow them to project the rather stinky and irritating soup at predators. Now, at this point, we're not spewing some dangerous scalding liquid, but that's really only a couple steps away. Introducing some peroxidase into the mix will split some of the peroxide into H2O and O2, upping the pressure and temperature of this mix, which will allow it to be propelled from the insect more forcefully. Finally, add some catalase to break down the hydroquinone, and the free diatomic oxygen can start heating things up. Now you have some explosive mix. At this point, you're basically at the Bombardier beetle. At no point in this process does the Bombardier beetle have any risk of blowing itself up. When Kent told Miss Lincoln about how the Bombardier beetle would blow itself up trying to evolve, he was either ignorant or lying.
That creature defies evolution, by the way. He had to be perfect from the beginning, or he'd blow himself up, would he not?
Not with the mechanism of a Bombardier beetle. Let's look at some footage of a Bombardier beetle. Notice how the excretion of the beetle is not fire, but a liquid spray. If you want a flamethrower to come out of an animal's mouth, you're going to need to find a new mechanism. Plus, unlike insects, vertebrates don't really just naturally make a bunch of hydroquinone, so where would they be getting it?
Okay, but here's an Ica-stone replica of a fire-breathing dragon. Maybe it's not a fairy tale after all. If he had twin chambers in his head, he could blow fire as well. In the book of Job, God talks about a fire-breathing, ocean-dwelling creature.
Yes, that's Leviathan, the Hebrew equivalent of Tiamat, the chaos serpent that according to the Psalms, God slew as part of the creation of the world. Just like how the Mesopotamian gods slew Tiamat to bring order to the cosmos from her primordial waters of chaos. This is part of a common motif in many world religions called the Chaos Kampf, in which God or the gods bring order to chaos by slaying some great monster. Now, it's not clear how literally many of these religions took this. It's possible they may have thought of the chaos monster as more of a metaphor or as a personification of the force of chaos and decay, or maybe they thought of it as a literal monster. But even if it's a literal monster according to the Bible, it's certainly not a dinosaur, because dinosaurs don't live in the ocean, except for like penguins, I guess. The hard-shelled eggs of dinosaurs make them rather unsuited to life as fully aquatic organisms, because they can't hatch their eggs internally like lizards can, and their eggs can't be abandoned like those of turtles, because their young need far too much care for far too long. The only exceptions seem to be the sauropods, who may have abandoned their eggs, but these creatures couldn't spend much time submerged, and were very far from being aquatic. Instead, they were already highly specialized land herbivores.
Let's see what else to show you. Let's go over here to the Ica stones. I want to explain a little bit about those. We were talking about Dennis Swift visiting us. Well, there's some... Our opponents say that the Ica stones are fraud.
Yes, because the man who made them said so, and even demonstrated how he made them. You can produce your own Ica stones. All you need is a stone, a chisel, a hammer, a modicum of artistic talent, and some cow dung. Simply carve your picture into the rock with your hammer and chisel. Feel free to draw on the rock first, as long as you wash it thoroughly. Then cake the rock in cow dung. Next, simply sit on a fire for a few hours. Wash it off, and boom! Instant Ica stone that even looks old. Further, the Ica stones lack one important thing that you need to authenticate an archaeological find. They lack provenance. Provenance is sort of like the chain of custody of evidence in a criminal case. In order for a find to be of archaeological significance, the exact location where it was found needs to be documented. This is also true in paleontology. Unfortunately, the Ica stones were supposedly found in a cave at an undisclosed location in Peru. That means that even if they were authentic, we couldn't know until the location of the cave is revealed, and hopefully, along with it, some remaining Ica stones.
That they are not ancient, that modern man has etched these. Well, let's look into that a little bit. There's a book on this by Dennis Swift, if you'd like to get it. It's a quick read and I really enjoyed it, okay? But the Ica stones were actually discovered by the Spaniards in the 1500s.
There were some authentic stones discovered in the 20th century, but they don't depict dinosaurs, aliens, or brain surgery like the famous ones. Those only start appearing after such things enter pop culture in Peru.
I don't think that's a fraud. Over 50,000 of them have been found. They are individual burial stones. So every time they find a new grave, they find a new stone.
I don't know how many total carved stones have been found. I'm not sure it's important. The ones that are unusual and come from this mysterious cave seem to be fewer in number, but even if they're not, I'm not sure why there just being a bunch of them is a problem. The man who said he made them had been doing it for decades, and while the process took a while, that's mostly the baking. He can carve them quickly and then bake a whole bunch of them in dung at the same time, meaning he could realistically make nearly 100 a week if he wanted. And since they sell well, why wouldn't he?
Maybe in scenes from that person's life. Don't know. Now, there have been cases where modern day people have tried to etch these so they can sell them for money. They're worth money. Dr. Hoven had several in his Pensacola museum, and I think he paid a couple $1,000s for each. So yes, people would fraudulently make them. However, does that mean these are not real?
Not on its own, but given the lack of provenance and the fact that they portray not realistic dinosaurs, but dinosaurs as seen in comic books and toys of the early to mid-20th century, all this adds up to not likely being real. Also, some of the stones depict aliens, so if these are evidence of dinosaurs, they're also evidence of aliens, which I don't think is something Cindi is prepared to believe.
That means there's a sum of both. And you have to discern if it's real or fake.
The real ones are the ones with documented provenance. The fake ones are the ones that don't, and depict unrealistic things that have no other evidence of existing in the area. If it doesn't have an unlikely subject matter or provenance, then I'm happy putting it into the category of things we probably can't know. But what dinosaur is this?
When we were talking about the crooked tail, the repeated theme of the crooked tail, there's a Bible verse about that. Isaiah 27 says, "In that day the Lord with his sword great and strong sword shall punish Leviathan, the piercing serpent, even Leviathan, that crooked serpent. He shall slay the dragon that is in the sea." More on that in the book of Job, like I mentioned before.
Dinosaurs don't live in the sea or have crooked tails. Further, the various aquatic reptiles also don't have crooked tails. Animals like ichthyosaurs, mosasaurs, pliosaurs, and turtles. None of them have crooked tails. The only place we see this crooked tail seems to be in art and literature, never in actual organisms.
Now, we have evidence on this wall of dinosaurs eating people. If dinosaurs ate people, wouldn't that mean they lived at the same time and not millions of years apart? Mm-hmm. So let's look at some witnesses of that. I have different continents with the same story. This is Wales. This is a cathedral in Wales. You'll see here's the eye of the dragon, here's the dermal frill, here's the mouth, and what is in his mouth?
Person.
Person. There's his two legs.
But it has the head and feet of a lion, not a dinosaur. So what makes this a dinosaur?
Okay, so Welsh is one witness. Witness number 2, this is an Aborigine artwork in Australia.
But here's the problem. That isn't an ancient Aboriginal painting. Those were done on rock. This clearly was not. Instead, it is a modern painting from the 1970s based on an illustration by Rudolf Zallinger. In fact, it shares the exact outline of Zallinger's line art. Further, plesiosaur necks can't do that. They were actually quite rigid. So this couldn't have been drawn from life. But don't take my word for it. That's according to Creation Ministries International.
And I mentioned Nessie has friends around the world. Tessie, Bessie. This is Yaru. Okay, in Australia they see the same plesiosaur-like creature and they call it Yaru.
But I can't find anything about Yaru that doesn't stem back to this painting and stories about it. It doesn't even appear on cryptozoology sites. Basically, there is no reason independent of this demonstrably modern painting to think that Aborigines saw any kind of plesiosaur-like animal living in the lakes of Australia.
And this piece of artwork shows, again, that Yaru isn't friendly. What's in the tummy?
Another person.
Another person. So all these friends are trying to save their friend. Okay, so 2 witnesses now on 2 continents that dinosaurs ate man.
Well, one jar depicting a lion-headed and footed creature, and one modern painting based on 1970s paleontology. I would put that at 0 witnesses.
Okay, 3rd witness. This is a Viking woodcut of a dragon swallowing a man. This is around the 11th century, so Vikings would be Scandinavia. 3rd continent.
But that's a dog-headed giant snake, not a dinosaur. See, the cool thing about the Yaru painting is that it's so identifiable as a plesiosaur, even if it may be in an anatomically impossible position. and that's why Cindi called it a plesiosaur. See, if this looked like any particular kind of dinosaur, we'd be able to name it. Instead, it's a chimera, and it looks like no animal, but has characteristics of two unrelated animals, carnivorans and snakes. So I'm sticking with 0 witnesses so far. After this, we see more Ica stones. I think I've covered that sufficiently. The dinosaurs shown on the stones don't look like actual dinosaurs, but like 1950s pop culture depictions of dinosaurs. And of course, as stated, we have good reason to think they're fakes, because the guy who faked them, Javier Cabrera Darquea, admitted it.
So again, we have the contrasting world view. We want you to not think that in the beginning dinosaurs were all that was there.
While dinosaurs didn't show up at the beginning in mainstream science's view, they are relatively latecomers in the 3 billion or so year history of life. Also, this poster is from the Walking with Dinosaurs movie, and in the American version, they decided to, for some reason, dub lines for the dinosaurs, and it is the worst thing in the history of dinosaur movies. Seriously, I'd rather watch Velocipaster than that. If you want to watch this movie, try to find the UK version, which has no voice acting, just animals doing things.
Or that they rule the earth.
Well, the idea of ruling the Earth is that they were the dominant megafauna for a while. It's not like there was a dinosaur empire, or was there?
We want you to put them together with presto changeo. All God's creatures lived together in a beautiful paradisical garden, if that's a word, paradise garden, with humans.
I look forward to having Ms. Lincoln present Kent's evidence for that.
When we're looking at the variety of created animals, a point we brought out before was something known as irreducible complexity. Okay, that means you cannot reduce these things. So they can't be partially evolved. Okay, all these creatures, this is a beautiful display of donated models that shows everything that they're made of.
But the problem with irreducible complexity is that it isn't a barrier for evolution. The definition of irreducible complexity that Michael Behe gives is, quote, an irreducibly complex evolutionary pathway is one that contains one or more unselected steps, that is, one or more necessary but unselected mutations. The degree of irreducible complexity is the number of unselected steps in the pathway. End quote. But the problem there is that it means you can't identify irreducibly complex structures, since you can't know ahead of time if their evolution involved unselected steps. An actually useful definition comes from William Dembski, who says that an irreducibly complex system is, quote, a system performing a basic function is irreducibly complex if it includes a set of well-matched, mutually interacting, non-arbitrary, individuated parts, such that each part in the set is indispensable to the maintaining of the system's basic, and therefore original, function. The set of these indispensable parts is known as the irreducible core of the system, unquote. The problem is that these systems can and do evolve. One of my favorite examples is the one given to me by Dr. Dan Stern-Cardinal. It's the VPU protein of HIV-1 group M. In this group of viruses, the VPU protein has developed a new active site within the last century that allows it to antagonize human tetherin, an immune system protein that normally would prevent HIV infection from taking hold. This active site requires 4 specific mutations that work, and without any of them, it can't antagonize tetherin and the virus can't spread in humans. See Dan's video above for a more in-depth explanation, but we also know other allegedly irreducibly complex systems can evolve, such as the bacterial flagellum, mammal blood clotting, the eye, etc.
So if you take out just one of those parts, if you take out one bone or one organ, the creature is going to die.
Well, yeah, all of these now quite derived and specialized organisms need their vital parts. But the thing is, you can find an organism out there that's missing any of these things and doing just fine. For example, sea lancelets do just fine without limbs. Flatworms do fine without respiratory systems. Cavefish do just fine without eyes. Sauropods did just fine without finger bones. Humans do just fine without tails. Coral do just fine without blood. Flies do fine with a heart but without veins and arteries. But once the system develops, it can later become vital to that organism. That doesn't mean it had to start that way.
Okay, think about this. What about a blood vessel with no blood? What evolved first, the blood vessel or the blood?
The blood. And we know this because many organisms today have what is called an open circulatory system, with or without hearts. Simple organisms like flatworms can get by without any real circulatory system. They just have fluids sloshing around. Organisms like arthropods get by with blood-like fluid called hemolymph that they pump around with a heart, but they don't have a network of veins and arteries like a human. Finally, we get to vertebrates like you and me. we have blood vessels to direct the blood to specific areas, so we know that blood vessels are less important than blood. Therefore, it's pretty easy to see which one would evolve first, and fortunately, we have examples of animals that don't have much in the way of blood vessels, but that do have blood.
They had to be simultaneously created and instantly together.
The continued existence of flatworms and arthropods seems to indicate otherwise.
Okay, so all these creatures we believe are just coming from the mind of the Lord. He invented them, created them, and poof, made them. He's not only ingenious, he's powerful. Okay? Now,
I'm not going to argue that God didn't create these animals. I'm just pointing out that these attempts to discredit evolution fail. If someone wants to take the position that evolution is indicated by the evidence, and there is not a particular reason from science to reject it, but they do anyway because they prefer to believe in a miracle that just looks like evolution, I can't really argue against that scientifically. I have some philosophical objections, but that's not what the channel is really about.
when you talk about things evolving, there's really no evidence that no matter how similar they look, like look, these all look similar, right? But there actually are no missing links.
Well, the phrase missing link is unfortunate, because if we find it, it's not missing anymore, and it implies that these links are typically missing at all levels of taxonomy, which is not the case. That's why I prefer the term transitional species, even though that also has some problems, but they are fewer. Let's look at some transitional organisms. We have Tiktaalik, which is transitional between basal lobe-finned fish and tetrapods. We have Protoceratops, which is transitional between basal marginocephalians and neoceratopsians. We have a whole host of transitional hominins between basal apes and modern humans. We have Probainognathus, which is transitional between basal therapsids and mammals, and we have many more. We have transitional monotremes, transitional snakes, transitional mosasaurs, ichthyosaurs, whales, birds, carnivorans, even-toed ungulates, odd-toed ungulates, elephants, bees, ants, scorpions, spiders, etc., etc., etc. Basically, I could do multiple feature-length videos just about transitional forms.
This is Stephen Gould. He's a very famous evolutionist. He's claiming the whole chain is missing. The absence of fossil evidence for intermediary stages has been a persistent and nagging problem for evolution.
There are a couple problems here. First, this is a quote mine, and the words missing between for and evolution are gradualistic accounts of. Gould here is complaining that gradualism would predict more transitionals that we find, and that was one of his reasons for suggesting punctuated equilibria, in which new species arrive relatively rapidly, and so we shouldn't expect to see many transitions between closely related species. Also, Gould didn't live to see many of the transitional forms we now have, and he was also aware of many transitional forms, such as Eohippus and Archaeopteryx.
There's another one up here. This is by Dr. Colin Patterson, who is in charge of the British Museum of Natural History. Okay, it's a museum, they have tons of fossils. He wrote a book about fossils. And somebody wrote him a letter and said, if you're writing a book about fossils, why are there no transitional ones? And the guy actually admits, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil. This is a guy whose job is fossils.
Yup, this is another quote mine, and one from a personal letter, so not something that is easily checked. Nevertheless, we are indebted to Lionel Thunison, sorry if I mispronounced that, for doing a whole lot of legwork on this one, including reading the revised book Evolution by Dr. Patterson, as well as trying to write to get the full text of the letter from the creationists publishing this quote. They refused to give it to him, which is contrary to academic standards of openness and honesty, so he eventually wrote to Dr. Patterson himself, who confirmed that he did not mean that there were no transitional fossils, instead simply that none of them could for sure be said to be ancestors of modern groups, rather than a side branch with no descendants. In fact, in the book itself, Patterson lists and talks about quite a few transitional fossils. He just doesn't make the claim that a particular fossil taxa is necessarily directly ancestral to any modern extant organisms. Further, this quote is inaccurate according to Dr. Patterson, who says it should be read, if I knew of any, fossil or living, for which an airtight case could be made, He included this part to indicate that we cannot be certain if a form is directly ancestral or not.
When you hear Richard Dawkins and all these other guys saying, there is just so much evidence, so many fossils you can't even list them. Actually, this guy says there's not one.
But unfortunately, Cindi has been lied to about the contents of that letter and the position of Dr. Patterson, who has complained about creationists misrepresenting him and doing so without reading the book in question.
Every fossil that you find is a complete animal. It maybe look similar to another animal, but it doesn't mean they changed one to another.
Well, of course, there is no such thing as a half-formed animal. Evolution doesn't predict such things. But there are simple animals, like coral or flatworm, who lack many of the organs that animals like humans or a dinosaur would have. And we have transitions between fully formed animals that are themselves fully formed animals.
This is one of the resources we recommend that talks about how every creature had to be abruptly created, fully formed. Okay, the subtitle here says Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design.
I can't really debunk that whole book in this series. I'll put a link to Jackson Wheat's excellent video on the Cambrian explosion, and if Cindi has more questions, she can ask me and we can talk about that.
Now, in the science books, they actually use two terms that are very similar to this, explosive origin, okay? The Cambrian explosion is something that scientists admit to. During what they call the Cambrian era, life from non-life just exploded into the fossil record.
This is incorrect. The fossil record of life extends back some 3 billion years. The Cambrian started some 540 million years ago, so life had already been around for just under 2.5 billion years before the Cambrian. That's a lot of time for evolution.
There was no transition from an amoeba. There were just all these varied life forms suddenly appeared. They use the word abrupt appearance.
This may have been accurate in about the 1970s, but we now know of plenty of Precambrian organisms that are transitional in nature leading up to the Cambrian, including things that look like they could be prototypical of arthropods, mollusks, and perhaps cnidarians. The Cambrian is now known to simply be a continuation of trends that started before it, such as trends towards more locomotion, as well as more predation and more need to fend off predators, which in turn led to the development of hard parts, which fossilize more easily. Also, the amoeba talking point is one of Kent's oldest and least correct. I don't blame Cindi for repeating it, as she clearly got it from Kent, and was not in a position to easily fact-check him. Nor did she likely see much need to do so to her then-partner. But it has never been the consensus of evolutionary biology that the amoeba is ancestral to animals. It is the consensus view that amoebas are a sister group to Obozoa, which includes animals, fungi, and certain single-celled organisms. So, whenever Kent says that animals are descended from amoebas, it's sort of like saying a person is descended from his fourth cousin. It's really not true.
Everything abruptly appeared. There are no transitional forms.
Here are some transitional forms from the Ediacaran to Cambrian animals. After this, Cindi recommends Creation magazine, but doesn't really give any arguments, so I won't address that except to say that I do not recommend that publication. She also talks about Darwin Devolves by Michael Behe, but really only as a segue to talk about Darwin's finches.
So here is Darwin's finches. This is supposedly what he decided proved evolution.
I think it's unfortunate that not just in creationism, but in the general field of science communication, that so much weight is put on these birds in terms of the evidence that Darwin put forth in his Origin of Species. They were significant, but so is biogeography of islands and his own breeding experiments, as well as records of breeding in both plants and animals. Basically, the finches inspired him and are a fun example, but they are really not necessary to his overall argument. Rather, they are illustrative.
He saw that on different islands, under different conditions, the beaks changed. He said, see, things are changing. However, you'll notice they are still finches.
Right, as required by evolution. Evolution is all about ancestry. Now, I'm sure that Cindi's mother had a mother who had a mother who had a mother. This woman would be Cindi's great-great-grandmother. Now, that makes her a descendant of that woman. Now, I don't know if Cindi has children or not, but let's just assume that she does for the sake of the argument. That woman, Cindy's great-great-grandmother, is her children's great-great-great-grandmother. And if her children have children, then they will still have that same woman as their ancestor. As long as Cindy's line does not go extinct, all the people in it will have that woman as an ancestor. That's also how evolution works. If your ancestry includes finches, then you are a finch, and you always will be. A nice way, I think, to illustrate this is to look forward in time to a hypothetical future. One of my favorite examples of such is a project called Serena, the World of Birds. I made a video about that, which is by far my most viewed video, but here I'll just show some pictures and link to that video. You see, on the fictional moon Serena, a population of canaries was released, and were the only terrestrial vertebrates on the planet. Over the course of hundreds of millions of hypothetical years, they evolved into myriad forms that you're seeing on screen now. But fundamentally, they are all canaries. They can't stop being canaries, because that's what their ancestors were. Now, as we look back in time, let's take a look at Darwin's finches again. They're technically not finches, but tanagers, the so-called New World finches. They are related to true finches because both are what's called passeroid birds. That is, basically, they're both songbirds. And according to evolutionary theory, their most recent common ancestor would be a passeroid bird. But it wouldn't be a true finch or a tanager, but as the original population of passeroid birds diverged and diversified, new subgroups grew up such as finches, tanagers, sparrows, cardinals, etc. But they never stopped being passeroid birds. Similarly, when some ancestral tanagers found themselves on the Galapagos Islands and then diversified into new species, those new species of necessity remained tanagers. This in evolutionary biology is called the law of monophyly. Essentially, it's just a formalization of the fact that you can't outgrow your ancestry. Your ancestors will always be your ancestors.
They're not changing into seagulls or any other kind.
Right, and if they did, it would be a big step towards disproving evolution. Because even if a finch evolved to be an omnivorous soaring seabird, it wouldn't be a seagull. It would be an oddball finch.
Microevolution does not prove macroevolution.
Microevolution is just evolution below the species level. So it is evolution that has not resulted in a new species. Macroevolution is evolution at or above the species level, and is the result of a lot of microevolution. Darwin's finches are in fact an example of macroevolution. Now I know Kent doesn't like these definitions, and that he has fed his own definitions to Cindi. But the fact of the matter is that if you have to change the definitions of technical terms in science to score some rhetorical points, you've already lost the argument. These are scientific, technical terms with technical definitions, and unfortunately, Kent gave Cindi the wrong definitions.
Okay? Natural selection selects from genes already available. Okay? The gene code is in your makeup, and it only has certain options. Okay? A finch gene code does not have the genes for a tail, does not have the genes for fur. It'll never get them.
Natural selection only selects genes that are already there. This is true. It cannot generate novel genetic variation. But let's see if we talk more about that. Finches do actually have tail genes. That's because birds actually do have tails. They're just short and nubby, and the distal ends are fused together, but that's a tail nonetheless. That's why you can see birds move their tail feathers. As for fur, correct, they do not have genes for that. But that is quite in line with evolution. According to evolution, you cannot simply borrow traits from separate lineages. At best, you can get superficially similar traits. For example, down feathers are superficially similar to hair and have some of the same functions, but they are pretty different in terms of growth and chemistry. In fact, if a bird could grow fur, that would be evidence of borrowing genes from mammals, which would have no evolutionary explanation and would be great evidence for a designer. Because we know from human designers that you can swap whole parts from one design to another. You don't have to only work with previous designs in the same lineage.
Okay? Quickly, micro and macro. This is an example of macroevolution, where you turn from an amoeba to an invertebrate, to a fish, to a reptile, to a mammal, to a man.
Well, I don't really like this picture because amoebas, jellyfish, and arthropods are all not ancestral to humans, but things that at least look like that fish, that early tetrapod, and that shrew-like animal are. But yes, ignoring the bottom three, the top four are basically correct. And that would be macroevolution because it involves new species coming into existence. But the problem is that we don't have any way to know if a new kind has arrived, if such a thing were to happen. And since macroevolution is minimally speciation, a wolf, a fox, and a coyote evolving from a single common ancestor is macroevolution. Because you have the fox in genus Vulpes, itself with several species, the wolf is Canis lupus, while the coyote is Canis latrans, so both of these pictures depict macroevolution, just one depicts a whole lot more. Now, this isn't to say that you can't reject the picture on the left while accepting the one on the right. You certainly can, it's just that you can't use the idea of micro versus macroevolution to do so.
That never happens. This is a fairy tale. Microevolution is small changes within a kind, okay? A wolf, a coyote, a fox, a dog might have a common descent.
That doesn't seem too far-fetched to me.
Okay, here's a bunch of dogs in the world. There's 300 breeds or something. And Dr. Hoven spoke to a dog breeder one time and she said, give me any mutt that's just a mixture of any mutt dog, and she could get all these in 100 years. I don't know how, but she and her family have been breeding dogs for many years.
I want to say something. First, I'm trying to be as respectful as I can. I understand that this is not an interaction and that this video I'm looking at was recorded a while ago. Now, I really wish creationists would stop contrasting themselves with, quote, the atheists. The opponents of young Earth creationists are not atheists. They're also not Christians, Buddhists, Jews, agnostics, etc. This isn't a fight between atheism and Christianity. This is a fight between a particular subsect of Christianity and the scientific consensus. That's why the guests I have on my channel are atheists, Christians, agnostics, etc. Second, you can't get all the variety in modern canids from just one breeding pair, unless you can generate new genetic variation. So setting aside the problems with timelines and inbreeding in such a story, if it is true that all modern canines descend from a single pair, but new genetic variety can't arise, then all canines couldn't have more than 4 variations per gene. But we know that isn't true. Canines have many more variations for many of their genes. So either Noah had to take a lot more than 2, as he was commanded, or new genetic variation can arise and then be selected for. So the previous point about natural selection only selecting from what is already there can't be a problem for evolution without also being a problem for Noah's flood.
Okay, so these are some of the things that vary. And we're going to talk about the difference between variation within a kind as opposed to variation that would take you outside the kind, okay?
Awesome. That is exciting. I am excited anytime there is an opportunity for the creationist kind to be well defined.
So here's a human kind and a bunny kind. The only thing that varies in a bunny pretty much is the color, maybe the length of the hair, size of the ear. It's not going to turn into any other creature.
Well, right, as we covered earlier, evolution says that once you're a rabbit, you're never not going to be a rabbit. But what about hares? Are they in the same kind? What about the pica? Are they in the same kind? How do we know? Also, I suspect that there are a lot of variations within rabbit, but I realize it's hard for most humans to recognize those variations. Humans are really good at telling the difference between different humans, but with other species, they're not so good at it. Probably because it's less important, since most other species, besides perhaps cats and dogs, which humans are good at telling apart, are not usually part of the human social sphere.
Here's some of the traits that vary in a human. You might have bushy eyebrows or skinny eyebrows, fat lips or skinny lips, freckles or no freckles, but they're all human.
Yes, but saying that isn't really saying something with lots of significance. If you pick a group of organisms, then point out variation within that group, then simply because you picked all members of the group at the first step, you will only have members of that group at the end. It's sort of like going to the store, grabbing a bunch of carrots, then measuring them in various ways and concluding that, yep, they're all carrots. Well, of course, you started out intentionally not selecting anything else.
This is the famous experiments of Mendel, purple peas and white peas, their seed colors, and how they vary and inheritance happens.
Those are some nice Punnett squares. I approve of this.
But again, micro changes never produce a different species.
But a single pair of canines on the ark producing foxes, wolves, and coyotes is new species.
Apes don't turn to humans.
But why not? Speciation can happen, and there is far more genetic diversity between a fox and a wolf than there is between a human and a chimpanzee. If that amount of genetic change is okay, then surely less genetic change would also be okay.
Macro evolution does not happen.
But again, the flood model being presented here requires extensive macroevolution.
Basically, the whole Mendel conclusion is kinds are stable.
I would like to respond to that statement, but I don't really know what it means. You see, we haven't been given a good definition of kind.
Let's see. Survival of the fittest, which is supposedly what creates variation,
No, that's mutation, ultimately.
does not explain the arrival of the fittest. Okay? Even if survival of the fittest to some degree may influence what traits come out at what time, you might get a hairier rabbit in a colder climate, it doesn't explain how the rabbit got here. Only God can do that. Sorry, guys. He's real.
Well, I certainly agree that selection doesn't produce new genetic diversity. Rather, it reduces it on its own. But mutation of necessity increases genetic variation by producing new genotypes that didn't exist before the mutation. It's logically impossible for mutation not to increase genetic diversity. Now, I'm not here to dispute God's existence. I'm perfectly happy for Cindi to believe in God. But it's simply not true that we need miracles to increase diversity and create new variations. Let's take a look at the Sphinx cat. This cat resulted from two different lines of hairless cat in North America which had a known mutation, and both occurred in the 1970s. So we have a known mutation, a time frame for that mutation, and the knowledge that this mutation wasn't present in older populations in that same area. So there it is, the arrival of a new trait. And you might argue that this trait isn't beneficial, but whether it's beneficial is dependent on environment. And in an environment where humans will help you eat, keep you healthy, and provide you with breeding partners, all simply because you have this new trait? That's pretty beneficial. But we also know about the mutations that allow the simian immunovirus to become the human-infecting HIV. And we know that had to happen sometime around the 1920s to 50s. So again, we have direct evidence for new genetic diversity arising from mutation and then being selected for.
Some variation has nothing to do with the environment or survival, it's just color variation. And these are different cat varieties.
But coloration does play a role in survivability. There's a reason wild tigers don't survive long if they're white, or why polar bears are all white, or why coyotes are basically the color of the desert. I'm not really sure what the argument is though. It's certainly true that animal colors vary.
Darwin himself acknowledged in his book, Origin of Species, page 211, if my theory be true, his theory about slow, gradual changes over millions of years, then numberless intermediate varieties, otherwise known as transitional forms, must assuredly have existed.
Yep, he did say that, and he was right. Fortunately, we have transitional forms as we've gone over. And also, Darwin's gradualism wasn't quite right. Often there are times when isolated populations undergo relatively rapid evolution, which is why transitional species within, say, a family are usually not too commonly found, although there are exceptions. But why we have abundant fossils linking together things from about the order on up through the Linnaean ranks.
He predicted that the fossil record would start to show these after his time.
Fortunately for him, one of the most impressive transitional fossils, Archaeopteryx, was found within his lifetime, at least partially confirming his ideas.
However, it's been 150 years, and we still have scientists telling us there are none.
Again, that's not actually true. Although I don't think Cindi is being dishonest, she was misled by Kent about a lot of these things, and this is simply one of them. We need to remember that Cindi Lincoln is Kent's victim, not his collaborator. My goal in this is ultimately to show her that he lies about even more than she thinks he does.
Okay, here we are in our man room.
Needs more video games to be a man room. Just kidding. I know it's about human evolution.
And one of the big things of evolution is that humans are animals.
So, animals are eukaryotes that lack a cell wall, are held together with collagen, and have an internal digestive system. This includes sponges, jellyfish, flatworms, insects, and yes, humans. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't make sense to treat humans as more important than other animals, and I think there are good arguments that as moral agents in a unique way, humans are quite special among animals. And if you want to put that in terms of the Imago Dei, or the image of God, then I have no quarrel with that. But from a scientific standpoint, there can be no argument that humans are animals. In Ecclesiastes 3:18 and 19, we read,
I said in mine heart concerning the estate of the sons of men, that God might manifest them, and that they might see that they themselves are beasts. For that which befalleth the sons of men befalleth beasts. Even one thing befalleth them, as the one dieth, so dieth the other. Yea, they have all one breath, so that man hath no preeminence above the beast, for all is vanity.
So even the Bible acknowledges the deep connection between humans and the rest of the animal kingdom, all while upholding human exceptionalism.
Everywhere you see this in the books, that humans evolved from monkeys. Take a look at these monkeys.
Well, yeah, although that means humans are monkeys, because remember, once a population diverges into a new group, its descendants are always part of that group. Also, some of those animals are not monkeys, some are lemurs, and I think I see a loris. Those are primates, but not monkeys. One quick way to tell if a primate is a monkey is to see if it has a wet nose. If it does not, it's not a monkey.
There's quite a variety of monkeys, but they are all unique.
I agree wholeheartedly, and the thing is that that's what evolution is all about. As new species branch off, they develop unique attributes that are not and cannot be shared with their relatives, who are now in different species, and this only compounds itself, so that over time one species can become 2 different species, and then they can become 4, even more different species, and so on. Then after a long enough time, you can get amazing diversity within a group like the monkeys.
I don't think this guy turned into this guy.
I don't either. Evolution doesn't say that modern animals are the ancestors of other modern species. Rather, that they share a common ancestor. Cindi pointed to a loris and a gorilla. The common ancestor of these animals was probably a creature that looked more like a squirrel than either of them, except it had nails instead of claws and it didn't have rodent teeth, and it had enclosed eye sockets. But then as it speciated and evolved, one lineage would develop nocturnal habits and, surprisingly enough, venom that it secretes from its armpits and rubs on its teeth, and ate fruit and insects. The other became big and terrestrial and specialized in eating leafy greens with a big pot belly for fermentation, and it lost its tail, but got significantly smarter. But one certainly didn't become the other.
And certainly none of them evolved into a human.
Again, and for the same reasons, this is correct. No modern species of monkey is ancestral to humans. They are cousins, not grandparents to humans.
This kind of thing that we see in the textbooks all the time, may I point out to you, this is an actual photo. This is an actual photo. This is all imagination. Doesn't happen.
Well, none of those are photos, it's a painting. But the stuff in the middle represents forms like Australopithecus afarensis, Australopithecus africanus, Homo habilis, and Homo erectus, all of which are real animals, of which we have hundreds of specimens. Now, the life reconstruction we can see here is obviously at least a bit speculative, and in reality, it's not a simple progression but a branching tree with side branches like Australopithecus boisei, which is on its own branch. But it's not really true to say that the middle 4 organisms are imaginary. What might be a more fair thing to do would be to dispute what those animals were really like, rather than saying they didn't exist.
If you go back over here, this is what I learned when I was in school. I learned about Nebraska Man.
That would be unusual. Nebraska Man was never widely accepted in the scientific community because of the fact that it was based on a single, very worn tooth. I don't know for sure what textbooks it may have made its way into, but it was few of them, because Nebraska Man was never really in contention for a human ancestor.
Now let me show you, if I could peek under the camera here. This is the one and only piece of evidence they used to create this whole false scenario.
Yes, Nebraska Man was based on one worn tooth, as I said. It turned out to be a peccary tooth, and that's why it was never taken seriously. One worn molar isn't enough to identify a hominin, especially when such identification was done by someone who was not trained in paleoanthropology.
Made me think that we had ancestors that were dumb, primitive, animal-like. This is a lie.
I mean, I don't know that I would call them dumb, but primitive and less similar to modern humans in terms of cognition does describe human ancestors. Just not Nebraska Man, because there's no such thing. Also, it's not a lie, it's a drawing made for a British newspaper, not a scientific publication, and it was entirely speculative. But there's a difference between drawing what you think something might have looked like, based on the idea that you think it exists, and intentionally deceiving people. So if that's a lie, then by the same standard, all the dragon pictures we saw earlier in this tour were also lies, because they were all different and can't all be the same animal. But I wouldn't go there, and I would hope that Cindi would not either.
They also found out that it didn't even belong to an ape or a human. It belonged to a pig.
Well, not quite a pig, but a peccary, which is what's shown in that picture. But yes, scientists who accepted evolution noted that it would be unexpected to find a hominin in ancient Nebraska, and then later again, evolutionary scientists identified the specimen as being a peccary molar. This is a demonstration of the self-correcting nature of science. False claims tend not to persist.
This is actually called the Hall of Shame. This is all, not, I don't know about all, but almost all of the so-called evidences used in our textbooks to say that humans and apes are related, that humans came from ape creatures. They all involve fraud. Sometimes there's filing down, there's staining, there's just plain wrong.
Okay, we have Heidelberg man, so Homo heidelbergensis. That's a valid taxon to this day. We have Nebraska man, which wasn't a fraud, but was not real. It was an honest mistake made by a non-specialist. We have Piltdown man, which was a fraud found out by scientists working on human evolution, not creationists busting evolution. We have Peking man, which was just Homo erectus, which is still a valid taxon. We have Homo neanderthalensis, which, while not directly ancestral to Homo sapiens as a whole, is still a valid taxon. And we have Cro-Magnon, which is just Homo sapiens, the species that's still around. The term Cro-Magnon isn't really used in the literature anymore, but it's not because the specimens it refers to have been debunked in some way, but because there's really no distinction to draw biologically between Cro-Magnon and modern humans. So of the 6 presented examples, 1 was a mistake, 1 was a hoax, both of which were caught by scientists using evolution to realize they didn't make sense, and there's nothing wrong with the other 4. Plus there are many hominin species left off of this entirely. I'd say that's actually nothing to be ashamed about at all.
Now, if you don't buy this, and if you start to think about what you're being taught, you'll realize that even in subtle places, there's the implication that ancient man was dumber.
Well, not ancient Homo sapiens, but given that human ancestors had less sophisticated technology, hugely lower levels of innovation, and smaller brains, when you get to other species of hominin ancestral to Homo sapiens, that's not an inaccurate characterization.
They were cavemen or didn't have technology.
Well, we know they didn't always live in caves, but we know some of them did, and it's certainly not the consensus view that they didn't have technology. There are literally billions of ancient stone tools in Africa showing that they very much did have technology. In fact, we now know that some troops of chimpanzees have technology, and even a crude but real archaeological record.
However, they are finding more and more examples of ancient man having high technology. Like more than we have?
Remember, just like with the Ica stones, we're going to need provenance. But if we have that, then I'm absolutely here for lost advanced tech. That sounds cool.
In a biblical worldview, Adam came directly from the hand of God. He would have been a genius. Now think about when you have your children. You try to have your children inherit all your wisdom. You teach them everything you can. How much do they receive? And how much do they reject? Okay, so I would submit to you that every generation loses a little bit of wisdom.
Most wisdom that you miss out on from your parents can be gained through life experience. And in fact, I know for my parents that's a lot of the wisdom they passed on to me. I also don't know how we measure wisdom to tell if it's going up or down. But I will say that the rapid pace of technological innovation we are currently experiencing says to me that humans are not getting dumber. I don't think they're necessarily becoming more intelligent in any significant way, but the overall trend does not seem to be towards significantly lower intelligence.
Now think about something as simple as the pyramids. We do not know how ancient man made those.
Well, we don't know for sure exactly what techniques were used, but we know that the technology was sufficient. Technologies like internal ramps, wooden sleds, and copper chisels, drills, and saws. All of that together is more than enough technology to make a pyramid like the ones in Egypt.
Right there proves to you ancient man was more advanced than us, not cavemen.
Well, nothing about the Bronze Age stonework means that ancient man was more advanced than modern man, quite the opposite. But on the other hand, that's just technological. There was no real biological difference between the humans who built the pyramids and the humans around today. They weren't stupid at all, but when we're talking about human ancestry, that goes beyond Homo sapiens and back to other species. We're not talking about the pyramids. The pyramids weren't built by Australopithecines, or even by early members of Homo like Homo erectus. So I'll agree that the humans who made the great cities of the Bronze Age, and even earlier, were not in any way less intelligent on average than current humans. That doesn't really say anything about Homo ergaster, etc.
Okay, let's go back over here. This is an example. We have seen a lot of the ichthyostones. Remember we saw those with dinosaurs eating people? Well, the ichthyostones actually show ancient man performing heart surgery, brain surgery, a C-section, and using telescopes.
Well, there's no reason to think that ichthyostones are real, but they also show aliens, yet creationists tend not to believe in aliens. So if we can't trust the stones on aliens, why should we trust them on surgery? Further, their depictions of dinosaurs are wildly inaccurate, so even if they were authentic artifacts, the best explanation still wouldn't be that they depict dinosaurs that the artists saw themselves. At this point, Cindi gives examples from ichthyostones. Since we don't have any good reason to believe that ichthyostones are authentic artifacts, I don't really feel like addressing the claims individually.
They knew how to use telescopes, which makes total sense when you just think about the Mayan pyramids. They were lined up with the stars. They knew more about the stars probably than you and me.
Well, at least the people whose job it was to keep track of the seasons, which is pretty important for an agricultural society, probably knew more about them than most people do. At least in the sense of they know where more stars are by heart, and when in a year you should see what stars and where. But there is no evidence of telescopes before the Renaissance. Instead, people used tools like sextants to measure the locations of stars above the horizon, a technique which is still used in navigation when relying on star charts.
Okay, so for some reason, the powers that be want us to not know that. They want us to think that we are animals.
But even if everything Cindi just said about ancient architecture, medicine, and astronomy were true, it wouldn't make humans not animals, because they still meet the definition in biology for animals.
So they have done all these so-called evidences for ape men. I would submit to you that every single one of them is either an ape or a man.
I would suggest that they are all apes, since humans are apes, but that I would need a good definition of man in order to figure out which, if any, of the presented skulls were human.
Let me remind you of a couple of things. Have you ever seen old men? Their eyebrows get big and bushy, and their ears get kind of bigger. My girlfriend had this joke. She used to get so annoyed when we would get behind a slow driver. And she'd say, "Oh, there's the big ears. It's an old guy on a Sunday drive. We're passing him." So when you get old, your ears and your brows get bigger.
Right, so the hair on the eyebrows gets bushy, and the soft tissues of the ears keep growing, none of which is skeletal, so it won't show up in a fossil skull.
Do you remember some of the skulls? They're trying to get us to think that we used to be an ape. They have the brow ridge that's pronounced. Could it be that when man used to live to be old, remember we learned about this in day 2? If man used to be 900, do you think he would have had a brow ridge?
No, because brow ridges don't grow with old age. That's not what happens when someone has bushy eyebrows. That's just long hair. Long hair can occur over any shape of bone.
Yeah. Okay. So again, if you find a skull with a big brow, or even a skull that he's crooked over like that, that doesn't mean he's a monkey. Maybe he had arthritis. He was old.
Well, a few things. We can use tooth wear as a proxy for age, and many of the skulls we have of human ancestors are not old, as seen by relatively unworn teeth. We actually don't really find stooped over hominins. It seems that the transition to upright walking started very early, so that's a non-issue. Lastly, how does this idea of the skulls being those of normal but extremely elderly people fit in with their smaller brain case sizes? People's brain cases don't shrink as they age, as far as I know.
Okay. Now this is a very interesting book called Buried Alive by Jack Quazzo. He was a dentist. Sorry, he might be still alive. Is a dentist. And he wanted to go to Europe and actually see these skulls. Okay? He went to Neanderthal Valley to see the Neanderthal skulls. And he discovered that the museums were actually putting the jawbone in a different place. Okay, he knew as a dentist where this joint is. And he could tell that they were purposely placing it at a different spot to make it look more like an ape. He noticed it at all the museums. That's quite a coincidence. He approached people about it, and guess what? They actually tried to kill him. They followed him around Europe, tried to kill him. This is his story if you'd like to read it.
Well, I don't know Dr. Quazzo, but his story seems false for a few reasons. First of which is simply that Neanderthals aren't thought to be the ancestors of modern humans, so there is no reason to make them seem more primitive to fit them into the story of human ancestry from other apes. Second, museum displays are not where the science is done. That's in literature. So an incorrect display doesn't really do anything to the science. Third, museums are not really staffed with assassins. They're usually operating on razor-thin margins, and even when people destroy invaluable art, artifacts, or fossils, it's rare that anything more than being asked to leave happens. Fourth, why did Dr. Quazzo go visit all of the museums when, at least according to the summary we just heard, his intention was to go see the skulls in Neander Valley? Which presumably means he wanted to see in situ skulls, not museum displays. Fifth, even if this is all true, since it doesn't involve any of the organisms in the ancestry of Homo sapiens, it doesn't really matter to the science of human evolution.
This is another book giving all the details that we had talked about earlier about the Hall of Shame, and how all the bones found that are supposedly ape men are actually either ape or man.
Okay, well, a friend of mine, Gutsa Gibbon, is quite familiar with this book and has covered its topics extensively, so check the link above for her channel and take a look at that stuff, because she does a much better job than I ever could.
One of the reasons they want us to think we're animals is because it's easier to kill animals.
I mean, I've killed some animals, but there are a lot of animals I'm not sure I could kill, especially not in a fair fight. Like, I'd take a pass on fisticuffs with an elephant. And yes, an elephant is bigger than a Ceratosaurus. I'm not as big as people think.
Okay, this is getting pretty hairy here, but you know that the majority of the population is pro-choice.
Not quite. From what I can tell from Gallup, pro-choice is more common than pro-life, but neither has broken 50% of the US population since 2018. But that's not terribly important, I suspect.
They believe that the population of the planet is a big problem, and that they want to eliminate especially unwanted babies. That way you can be free to have sex with anybody you want to with no responsibility of a child.
That's more antinatalism than the typical pro-choice position. Most pro-choice people base their stance on things like bodily autonomy of women and reproductive rights, rather than on ideas of overpopulation.
So, these drawings here are done by Ernst Haeckel, and he's trying to tell us that inside the womb, the baby looks like a fish baby, and a salamander baby, and a turtle baby, and that they all look the same. And that in the womb, the human baby recapitulates its evolutionary history. Now, he was convicted of fraud, and he actually admitted that these are drawings, not photos. He made them up. He didn't even try and make them look like the real thing.
Haeckel was never convicted of fraud. There is, as far as I can tell, not even a record of a trial for such. He did admit that a few of his drawings were done without referent, because, as he stated, at that stage and with his technology, no one could tell the difference between the embryo that he was actually drawing and one of the species he used as a label. He was correct about this. He did not need to admit that these were not photographs, because photography wasn't really a thing at the time. He certainly did make them look like the real thing, and unlike the bottom row of pictures we were shown, he explicitly removed yolk and maternal tissue and oriented the embryos all the same way for ease of comparison. Now, Haeckel was wrong about his capitulation theory, and now the science of evolutionary and developmental biology, or Evo-Devo, doesn't really operate under Haeckel's ideas, owing more to another man, Carl Ernst von Baer.
Down here we see the actual photos of the real thing. Fish embryo, salamander embryo, turtle embryo, chicken, rabbit. That does not look like a human embryo to me, but that's what it says there.
And here's what those pictures would look like if we follow the rules that Haeckel used to remove maternal tissue and orient them all the same way. Not so different looking, or so different from the original pictures. Now, I'm not arguing that people should still be using Haeckel. They shouldn't. We have high-res photographs now, and his ideas about the development of animals is quite off. But we need to be fair to him, especially since he can no longer defend himself.
This is actually a real human embryo, 12 weeks in the womb. It's obviously a human child.
I agree, it is obviously a human child, and I think that one of the worst pro-choice arguments out there is that a fetus isn't alive or isn't human. It's obviously both, and we can't have a reasonable discussion about the topic without starting from a point of understanding the basic facts of the matter. Now, I'm not going to have that full discussion on this channel, because this channel is about science and not social issues or political issues, but yes, Cindi is correct about that being a human.
And again, even if they were similar, it wouldn't mean they were evolved. It means they've got a common function, okay? They're trying to say if we have similar arm bones, that means we evolved one from another common ancestor. Well, actually, no. It means we all need arms. We live in the world. We have to be able to pick things up. We have to be able to eat. Common function, not common ancestor.
Okay, I really like this because it provides us with a testable hypothesis. So when a designer designs something for a particular purpose, they can grab things from unrelated designs that work well. This happens a lot in computer coding. There are whole websites dedicated to people uploading code that others can download so that they can just take that code and plug it into their program. A lot of game development works that way. On the other hand, for different uses, there is no reason to reuse old designs. You can start from scratch. So if life is designed by a common designer, we should expect organs with the same function to have the same underlying anatomy, and those with different functions to have different design. Well, Cindi was talking about arms and using them to grab food. Let's look at arms used to get food. We'll take a look at the human arm, a mantis arm, and an octopus arm. One has a series of internal bones and muscles that pull on the bones. Another has an external skeleton with muscles and hydrostatic pressure. Another has no skeletons and just rings of muscle. So this does not support the hypothesis of a common designer. But let's look at some very different forelimbs. Here's the foreleg of a dog, the arm of a human, a whale flipper, and the wing of a pterosaur. Now, according to the design hypothesis, since these all have different function, there is no reason for them to have a similar underlying anatomy. Yet they all have the same bones in the same order, but with different functions. So on both ends, the design hypothesis is falsified. But these odd patterns of similar form, different function, and different form, same function is predicted by evolution. At this point, Cindi starts talking about the leader of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and I'm just going to say this, even if her claims are true, that he were an ardent believer in evolution, and it inspired his ideas and crimes, that doesn't make evolution any more true or false. So that's all I'll address.
Okay, and then this is an actual human skeleton. The reason I have it here is because it shows red, yellow, black, or white. We all have the same skeleton. We are all human. The Lord made each of us with a soul. Animals don't have souls. They don't stand before God and give account for their life.
I'm not going to dispute whether souls exist and whether there's a final judgment. That's not what this channel is for. But I'll repeat something from the Bible. Ecclesiastes 3:18 and 19.
I said in mine heart concerning the estate of the sons of men, that God might manifest them, and that they might see that they themselves are beasts. For that which befalleth the sons of men befalleth beasts. Even one thing befalleth them. As the one dieth, so dieth the other. Yea, they have all one breath, so that man hath no preeminence above the beast, for all is vanity.
So even biblically, we know that humans are animals. Now, I'm perfectly happy to grant that humans are unique, but being unique among a group doesn't make you not part of the group. For example, let's say you had a sports team, say basketball. All the players but one are over 6 feet tall, and that one other player is 4'6". That player is unique, but he's still on the team. That's the last argument. From there, it's an invitation to come to Dinosaur Adventureland and Kent doing a demonstration about human perception using a kid and a spinning chair. I feel no need to address any of that. Well, with that, we're done looking at this particular tour. I really hope that Miss Lincoln sees this and realizes that I'm not here to antagonize her. My goal is to help her get completely out from under Kent's influence. Now, I want to remind everyone watching this that you absolutely should not be anything but kind to Cindi Lincoln. She's Kent's victim and deserves our sympathy and help, not any mockery or vitriol. Overall, I hope you enjoyed this series. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. I just want to take a second to thank my channel members and patrons, especially those pledging $20 and above. Bob Knob, Bent Hovend, Ian Chen, Chris Love, Sphincter of Doom, The Venerable Bede, and Res Instance. My channel members and patrons help make this channel possible, and without their support, this channel really wouldn't exist. If you would like to help support the channel as a member or patron, there are links in the description to both join the channel as well as join the Patreon. Patrons and members get mentioned in these credit scenes, as well as getting early access to my scripted videos. And if you pledge $10 or above, you can also get access to various 3D assets that I create for Blender, both for use in the channel, as well as just general giveaways to my supporters to help in any Blender projects they might have. If a monthly or annual pledge isn't for you, then there is also a merch store linked in the description. And if none of that's right for you, please just like and subscribe, because every like and subscription really helps the video out. Thank you.